Welcome to this rapid revision session looking at the destruction of the Plains Indians' way of life. There's going to be a bit more to cover in this particular rapid revision video to some, so this might be a little bit longer, but however it'll be worth it because we'll sum up all the main points of what happened. Let's start with the image at the top of this screen. This is very clearly a posed propaganda image, but it shows 3 Lakota boys at an industrial school in around 1900. Industrial schools were schools that were designed to try and change the Plains Indians' way of life. And we can see in this posed photograph that these Indian boys are in their traditional clothes on the left, and on the right, the way that they are sitting, standing and dressed has completely changed. In essence, their Indian identity has been virtually removed from them. The first action to know about is the destruction of the buffalo. So let's sum up the main points. The destruction of the buffalo took place between the 1870s and 1880s, but the peak was between 1872 and 1874. During this time, professional buffalo hunters hunted millions of buffalo, as can be seen in the pictures. Why? Because the hunters sold the hides, that's the skin of the buffalo, to make leather. Each hide was worth around $1 to $3. Not a great deal, even for then, so you'd need to hunt a lot of buffalo to make money. How did they do it? Well, ultimately they used powerful modern rifles to kill millions of buffalo. They gained access to the plains by railroads that had been built. The effects were devastating for the Indians. The hunters only took the hides, leaving the rest of the buffalo to rot on the plains. The Plains Indians found this deeply offensive. After all, they famously used every part of the buffalo and wasted very little, except that they left some behind for the Great Spirit. They believed that this desecration of the buffalo made the Great Spirit make the buffalo disappear. Ultimately, it was of course the overhunting that made the buffalo disappear, but the Plains Indians saw it at a more spiritual level. The conclusion is that by 1883 there were basically no buffalo left. They were virtually wiped out. The Plains Indians, who were still nomadic by that point, and that was reasonably few by that point, had lost their main resource to support their lifestyle. These sources will help illustrate the point. Source A shows a pile of thousands of buffalo skulls near a bone processing plant in the 1880s. Bones were ground up to make fertilizers and glues. Just look at the size of that pile. Each one of those white dots represents an individual buffalo. Also, we can see another example here. These aren't necessarily professional hunters. These are people who are just there, frankly, to have fun. Tourists hunting buffalo from a train. Railroad companies sold such hunting trips as pleasure trips, with the trains slowly puffing along the tracks, giving a reasonably steady platform for the hunters to shoot as many buffalo as they wanted. Let's have a look at the next action. I've tried to sum this up as extermination and government policy. This took place between the 1880s and 1890s, during which time the US government treaties forced Indians to find new ways to survive after the buffalo were destroyed, so you can see that there is a connection here. Government treaties said Indians could use hunting grounds as long as the buffalo remained. When the buffalo went, Indians had no choice but to take up ranching or farming. And we've got to look at this from a slightly cynical point of view. The Indians had hunted the buffalo for thousands of years. The idea that they could disappear within just a few years would never enter their heads. But with the US government aware of the numbers of buffalo being hunted, to say that the Indians could stay as long as the buffalo remained was actually very temporary to the US government, even if it felt permanent for the Indians themselves. The US government passed laws and treaties that controlled the Indians in the wake of this. And the effects were that the Indians either adapted, relied on government handouts, or they simply starved to death. This meant that the Indians were reliant on the US government to survive, so had no choice to do as the government wanted. And that brings in our third point. Cultural change. Between the 1870s and the 1890s, there was a great deal of cultural change, which was deliberately engineered by the US government. Indians were forced to change their culture and away from the tribe and their traditional way of life, and to a way of life more like the whites, which was rather more individual. Why? Because the government wanted to reduce the power of tribal chiefs to resist their control. Indian boys went to schools to learn English and get a white-style education. Hunger and desperation made Indians adopt farming instead of hunting. The effects were that some Indians adopted white ways and assimilated as US citizens. Others continued to resist or went back to their old ways when they found white culture did not work for them. They suffered unemployment, depression and disease, and ultimately many died. Let's look at some accounts from people themselves. Our first source is by Chief Sitting Bull. He said this in 1882. "The life my people want is a life of freedom. I have seen nothing that a white man has, houses or railways or clothing or food, that is as good as the right to move in the open country and live in our fashion." There was often a perception that the US government was in some way doing the Indians a favour, making them live the so-called more civilised lifestyle. But this quote by Sitting Bull shows that that's definitely not the attitude of the Indians. There was nothing wrong with their lifestyle. After all, they had survived using it for many thousands of years, and so they saw no freedom in being made to act in a different way. The next quote is from Plenty Horses, who was an ex-Indian school pupil. He said this in 1888, basically speaking with hindsight after his school education had failed him. "I found that the education I had received was of no benefit to me. There was no chance to get employment, nothing for me to do to earn a living or remain with the whites. It disheartened me, and I went back to live as I had before going to school." The next part of getting the Plains Indians to live more like white people was the Dawes Act. This was passed in 1887, and it was a US law to encourage Indians to farm land as families, not as tribes. The government wanted to break up the tribal system and give reservation land to individual Indian farmers. In many respects, this is really similar to the Homestead Act of 1862. Indian families were given 160 acres to farm. Single people got 80, orphans under 18 got 40, and it was considered that was more manageable for them to do. And ultimately, they got to own that land if they successfully farmed it. However, the effects were devastating for many Indians. Those Indians who took up the offer were usually given poor land that did not support them. Others lacked the skills to farm successfully. After all, they had never done farming before and never really experienced it. Some starved, but more gave up and moved back onto the reservations. Overall, the policy ended up reducing the amount the US government had to spend supporting the Indians. Imagine it this way: a part of reservation land is set aside for the Dawes Act and divided up into homesteads. Some Indians move on to those homesteads, but when they surrender them and give them up, that land then reverts to the US government. Overall, the reservation would have got smaller. So let's sum up some final points. From the 1860s onwards, the way of life of the Plains Indians was systematically destroyed. The Indians were moved onto reservations, which restricted their rights to hunt the buffalo. Then the destruction of the buffalo ended their independent nomadic lifestyle. And so the Indians relied further on US government support and the reservation system. Moves were made to undermine Indian culture and to cause their assimilation, ultimately for the Indians to become more similar to white European descendants. The Dawes Act further compelled Indians to adopt a European farming lifestyle and lose their land in the process. In the exam, you might find that you have to give a narrative account of how this affected the Indians, and so have a look at how these events link together. It starts off with the destruction of the buffalo, which means that the Indians rely on government help, which means that the Indian way of life can be undermined by European-style education, and ultimately the Dawes Act finishes it off by taking their land and either making them live like European farmers or to give up their land altogether. One leads to the next, leads to the next, and analysing those points is what you would need to do in a narrative account question in the Edexcel exam. I'll have a future video giving you some advice on how to write some questions, but for now, that's it for this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you've got a topic that you're desperate for me to do a rapid revision video on, then please pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, I'll say thanks for watching and basically, goodbye.